Professor Humphrey and colleagues, thank you so much for the privilege of me being in this position. I think that the last person in a series occupies a rather particular place. I'm delighted to be here. Sometimes the most simple-minded expressions are the hardest to understand. Their very ease of assimilation seems to make reflection redundant. The idea of the big society aka David Cameron, is a beautiful example. Now, the other speakers you've heard have, in diverse, fascinating ways, described crucial dimensions of the world in which we live, indeed sharpening our sense of being in a world, in society. To their accounts, one can add the fact that the world is full of people who have their own descriptions of it. People understand it in all kinds of ways. And one of the issues that a social anthropologist would stress is how on earth one deals with other people's understandings. Now, this is not going to be a lecture about David Cameron, but I am going to rise to CRASSH's original provocation, which put the big society side by side with Margaret Thatcher's declaration that there was no such thing. As we shall see, they're not actually so far apart. I'm interested in the kind of power the idea of a big society has or doesn't have, and in the damage it inflicts. And that is in order to take on what seems one of the least appealing aspects of society, as the concept is generally used in common parlance, namely its vacuousness. When they describe things with reference to society, people usually expect this vague and indeterminate term to be taken for granted. And big society just seems a bigger version of the same vacuousness. Indeterminacy is true for many bits of our language, of course. The interest of society is that it's also a steer for policy and is promulgated with political intent. Okay, so what's the point of vacuousness? It'll be interesting to go down the road of semiotics or discourse analysis, but there's a little bit of anthropological work to be done that will take us along a different track. We don't have to give over the concept of society to the politicians' descriptions. Other people's descriptions of the world may be interesting too, and it would be foolish to blank out this term, society, in advance. It may even be that some anthropological detours elsewhere will allow us to break out of the impasse of the simple-minded. Here's an ethnographic vignette from the other side of the world, Australia, where the Northern Territory Health Services has for years been addressing the ever-deteriorating plight of the Aboriginal population. The more it tries, the more it fails. The need to coordinate services proliferates in efforts described variously as collaboration, cooperation, networking, team building, information sharing. Yet there's a conundrum. The greater coordination the government aspires to, the greater fragmentation it sees. The deliverers of care want to do their best by the systems of organisation that also organise them, for intervention through organisational means is, they hold, what makes the organisation work. Faith in being able to change things by the power of description includes describing bureaucratic performance itself. At the end of every day of their exhausting induction in the field, new recruits are presented with evaluation sheets. Always working to improve the programme, the organisers themselves beg for feedback on how they've carried out their job. Of course, such audit addresses the officials' effectiveness as service providers, not the outcomes for the health of the population. Through implementation plans rolled out with performance indicators, direct evaluation is one among many instruments for monitoring impact, such as annual reports, data summaries, programme reviews, and project status reports. An inordinate amount of time, many observe, is taken up with paperwork. On the one hand, then, the generation of intense social activity, everything operationalised in order to provide services. On the other hand, the huge overburden that too much activity creates. Just the kind of situation that the UK government's criticism of bureaucracy is all about, though here the overburden is always portrayed as backstage and never as front line. We shall come back to health workers. In the meanwhile, I must lay some initial ground for saying there's something interesting here for understanding society. My specific focus is the treatment of concepts. Probably one of the few agreements you'd find among social anthropologists these days is that the concept of society is analytically useless, absurd even. It remains in constant use, but has lost its old power to compel theorization and stimulate model building. Only in a weak sense does it index diverse orientations, such as an emphasis on interconnection or on some kind of self-generating coherence. At the same time, there are positive reasons for not treating it as an analytic. As Henrietta Moore puts it, where once we spoke of dialectics and structures of society and mind, all the talk now is of potentialities, emergent properties, forms of becoming, and modes of attachment and affect. Society gets in the way, to borrow a phrase from Bruno Latour, not only of grasping emergent forms, heterogeneity or flux, but of the very attempt to understand what is intrinsic to social life. Sociality, relations, relational materiality, assemblage, and so forth. The social doesn't need society to prop it up. But then again, Latour himself would say that without a lot of reassembling, the social itself can be a misleading entry into understanding agentive and interactive life. Yet the concept of society is not just dribbled away or got out of focus or been transformed into something else. I want to make a different kind of claim, one that speaks to usages in common circulation. The concept of society is analytically useless, but rhetorically powerful. Within anthropology, society shares a rhetorical status similar to others that often turn out to be analytically impossible. Human rights, property, women have all occupied this position. The discipline cannot actually dispense with society. To refer to society already acknowledges the significance of organizational formations for, say, power relations, inequalities, contexts of agency. For the ethnographer, it captures an aspiration to study in the round, to reveal the relational nature of phenomena. But above all, and hence the comparison with human rights, property, and women as rhetorical forms, in many places society exists in common parlance as a local endogenous reference for people's action. And I'm quoting Ingold when I say, discourse on society is just as much part of the reality we study as it is of our anthropologist's way of studying it. Now one can hear a similar rhetoric in present-day UK political life. Society evokes values of almost cosmological persuasion. Yet if society is analytically useless for the anthropologist, what about policymakers? I suspect the answer is that no amount of calling on society will operationalize it. Probably then, for all that the concept of society is rhetorically powerful, it is governmentally useless. And the recent move to gigantism only enlarges that the wheeling in of big society as though calling it big could generate some kind of size or bulk. It is precisely the way in which appeal is made to an unspecified notion of society that gives good rhetoric its persuasiveness. Lack of specification means that the notion can be deployed in all kinds of contexts. This is the cosmology of it for English speakers. Thus, society's removed and abstract status is what makes giving to it, as in doing things for the sake of society, virtuous. We may think here of discussions of altruism, for example, in blood or tissue donation. By the same token, it has its proxies in the concrete here and now. The rhetoric works where people know for what structures or associations the concept serves as a proxy, such as thinking for others, interdependency in general, the state in a welfare mode, neighborhoods, and so forth. They imagine they know what is meant in their immediate experience by this to-be-filled term. All that's happening, it would seem, is that the government is relying on what people take for granted, that is, on this understanding of theirs. At the same time, understanding is nudged in certain directions. The nudge is rather like the light touch audit of organizations, validating the auditor's values through finding an internal or innate correspondence to them. Only in the case of society, an organizational form has to be invented. Hence the specific vision of local and community life enshrined in the Localism Act of 2011. Such life is imagined as being continuous with people's assumptions about innate social values. So let's look at the endorsement of community, for here surely the big society is being defined. And I'm quoting from the Minister of State for Decentralisation. When I quote, I'll keep my head down. We think that the best means of strengthening society is not for central government to try to seize all the power and responsibility for itself. It's to help people and their locally elected representatives to achieve their own ambitions. This is the essence of the big society. So society is set against the state, or at least government, and that helps definition for a start. The next paragraph specifies councils, local charities, voluntary groups, and new rights and powers for communities and individuals. It's all about what local people want. And on communities, more apparent specification. People who look out for their neighbours, who take pride in their street and get involved, not to speak of community groups who will be able to buy assets. Oh, and neighbourhoods who will be able to keep some of the proceeds from infrastructure development. There is an astonishing presumption here in nudging citizens towards localism, that when you think about people in society, you think about local people. What about a nudge towards internationalism? But once we're over that astonishment, we can see that the vision of community groups and the rest merely pushes lack of specificity down a rung. It endorses the fact that society can only materialize in the concrete structures or behaviors to which people can apply it. No doubt all kinds of organizations or outlooks can become identified with community groups, especially if they can wield asset-holding power. So what will ensure that groups and assets are somehow formed for public benefit? Nothing concrete, only a more urgent sense of society and community as benign visions of empowerment. Not the Local Authorities Standards Board, which has been abolished, and certainly not remote quangos, many also abolished, some of which might have assumed that local people were also national people. Relying on an unspecified society to do the government's job of oversight is the silly bit. And more, I want to suggest that there's a serious sense in which such usage trashes the very object it is supposed to uplift. The object in question is not a social life that has somehow managed to survive all this time in communities and localities. Rather, it is precisely society as a rhetorically summonable and otherwise empty concept. Whatever one's views about state interference versus responsibility, it is in truth society's vacant or cosmological connotations that the big society takes away from it. It is as a vacant, unspecified concept that society works as a generalized, abstract instrument of appeal. Gigantism diminishes it, shrinks it to the size of the epithet itself, society reduced to being big. Now, one could put a more kindly gloss on this. I'm thinking of a description of divination in Cuba by one of Caroline Humphrey's distinguished students, and how to understand diviners' verdicts on their clients' condition that they present for curing. Not as definitions understood as truth claims, he suggests, but as inventive definitions or infinitions. Infinitions are not claims about the world, but ontological interferences in it. The client is transformed into a person who's been suffering an affliction, witchcraft, say. Does this work for big society? Well, the phrase certainly doesn't define anything that existed before it, yet it's not really a performative speech act either, since it doesn't bring a big society into existence. However, it brings a concept into existence as though by magic. As an inventive definition, the enunciation of the big society becomes a reference point that has already changed things, such as the orientations of research councils. It's a new reality to be taken into account, and from this viewpoint, actually makes further specification or definition irrelevant. But then consider how this concept is being treated. There's no client, no one asked for a cure, no one is looking for a precise solution to a problem. Rather, the phrase is thrown into the ether, and it can only be picked up by those who assume they know what is meant. Yet what the big society trashes is precisely this assumed, and if one is inclined, cosmological character of the concept. Whether people think of innate social values as arching over collective life or as percolating through it, the reality of the apparent emptiness of society might have been significant, if only because everyone has his or her own idea about how it's to be filled, and we might want to take care of that, a point I'll come back to. Ponder on the place that any taken for granted status has in motivating the work of concepts. To be able to assume something renders it axiomatic, and many Euro-Americans or English speakers would like to think that what they value, even though the same would go precisely for other people's prejudices, would like to think that what they value forms an unspoken basis to what they do, and they may well include society in the abstract here. Yet in dwelling on the taken for granted, we've only had half the picture. For there's another side to leaving social values implicit, and that is the duty to be explicit. However, in order to show the kind of accomplishment this is, I need a foil to what English speakers would take as an ordinary state of affairs. To get to the other half, then, it's helpful to take another detour before coming back to questions about society. Two recent accounts, one from the Ecuadorian Andes and the other from Venezuelan Amazonia, focus on how the world might be changed. In both places, it's thought possible to alter one's race or body through the process of becoming white or criollo. Their ethnographers tease this out through the apparatus of modern healthcare, from the Andes in private fertility clinics largely outside the state, from Amazonia in state-provided health services. In both cases, the care that is offered recipients or clients is taken by them as signs of their own increasing ability to enact whiteness. Through receiving this care, they become white people. What practices of caregiving could have such transformative effect, and above all, what assumptions are they based on? In the Catholic Andes, the epithet assisted before assisted reproduction takes on unexpected resonances. God is everywhere, an immediate, not distant presence, and God's giving of life is constantly brought home, a presence harnessed by clinics. The scientific techniques that assist medical procedure are the means through which the clinical personnel assist God. The ethnographer observes that the doctors do not perceive themselves as playing God, but rather as God's helpers. Patients are in turn assisted. The focus for many here is less the modification of the materials of fertility, IVF or embryo freezing or whatever, than the patronage that is bestowed upon them. Private medical clinics are based on paternalistic, not consumer-oriented relations. Patronage is acted out through all the social activity entailed in attending to the patient's health and comfort. This relationship of dependence is actively sought by many Ecuadorian women. They look for assistance for, and I'm quoting, assistance, not autonomy, is the very base of existence. What is demonstrated at the clinic is that the patients are worthy of care. At the same time, these people are participating in Ecuador's nation-making through the process of whitening. especially for poorer people or clients of Indian background. To be the object of such attention is transformative. In the care of white, as doctors and clinical staff categorically are, the client becomes white. I quote again, "Through IVF, women can become whiter reproducers through being cared for the way whiter women are cared for." And this is based on a grounding assumption about the malleability of bodies and of the material world. The anthropologist sustains a running contrast with attitudes derived from the European Enlightenment to be found in Euro-American accounts of assisted conception, as Sarah Franklin's work has shown. Among them, the kind of agency entailed in a nature-society paradigm, whose starting point is that nature is a given. In the Ecuadorian Andes, approaches are more likely to have their roots in religious categories based on pre-Enlightenment and certainly pre-biological descriptions of lineage that were precursors to the contemporary concept of race. The continuing assumption is that in Ecuador, people can change their race. This is perceived as an ontological transformation. To use anachronistic language, nature is not changed by society. Indeed, one does not require for this a notion of society, only that, witnessed in the miracles of the everyday, through divine agency, nature itself can be changed. Like the Andean clinicians, Venezuelan doctors working with Yanomami Indians are criollos, whites. But rather than an identification between doctors and patients, there is disjunction. Yanomami perceive a continuum between those who are more and those who are less criollo, white, yet at any moment will juxtapose positions radically other to each other. Otherness is not diminished by the continuum. Rather, people assume positions that are now white or criollo, now Indian or Yanomami. Now, this isn't seen by the medical staff, who understand becoming criollo as an evolutionary or developmental process. Now, in the becoming white that might have a transcendent or cosmological value for criollo medical staff, and I'm thinking of the inevitability of the modernization that they represent, but that goes beyond their efforts to assist it, holds a different place in Yanomami thinking. What for the Yanomami is prior to action, and in that mode inevitable, is the social condition of alterity. There will, must, always be others. The kind of care that the Yanomami would like to elicit from the white doctors, often frustrated in an echo of the chronic short-termism also found in the Northern Territory's health service, is the care of kinship. Affinity is an innate condition of the world of social convention that Yanomami take for granted. Outsiders must be domesticated into the status of potential in-laws or affines who will mediate between Yanomami and the outside world. Like race, whiteness, kinship is to be made. So Yanomami are trying to change criollos as much as the reverse, not to make them Indian, but by turning them into potential in-laws, keep up the flow of services, knowledge and goods that only criollo can bring. Now, in their civilizing mission, the ethnographer says, criollo doctors are wanting to change indigenous lifestyles, and in doing so, they are in effect making society. And I quote, "One component of the civilizing project is about making society, not kin, because for criollos, society was missing from Amazonian life and needed to be made." And in another echo of Australian health services, doctors see Yanomami as a part of nature, above all disorganized, and the more disorganized Yanomami appear, the more doctors strive to organize. White criollos' Enlightenment-derived efforts understand society as a developmental project in relation to nature. The differences between what Yanomami on the one hand and the white medical personnel on the other take for granted and what they assume as given in the world. and what they assume is given in the... Sorry, got the stress completely wrong. Allow me to re-stress that sentence. The differences between what Yanomami on the one hand and white medical personnel on the other take for granted, what they assume as a given in the world, and what they regard as subject to people's interventions. Again, using the language of society, one could say that the social conventions that are innate for Yanomami are, for Criollo, taken to be fabricated through social means. Each, in fact, enters the other's world as a form of the innate. Whites appear to Yanomami as potential affines, and Indians appear to the doctors as children of nature. So perhaps I've exaggerated the demise of society as an analytical construct. What the Amazonian ethnographer refers to as making society are all those activities, modes of relating and collaborations requiring organizational effort that characterize explicit projects of Euro-American modernity. And we can show where they do and do not have purchase. They move neither the Yanomami nor Ecuadorian patrons and clients, but they are abundantly present in the bureaucratically inspired programs to tackle endemic health in Northern Australia, possibly to be found in the less paternalistic of the fertility clinics of Ecuador, and certainly in the travails of young Criollo doctors undergoing training on field assignments in Amazonia. This is not a matter of some people having and some not having a concept of society. To my mind, the interesting comparative question is about what people thinks needs making and what agents might be enrolled to this end. So what is the other half to understanding the taken for granted? It is briefly what needs to be made and made explicit by deliberate effort. The Prime Minister, quote, We're not standing back and just hoping that the big society arrives. We're clearing the obstacles away, and then we're taking some specific steps to help build it. From this point of view, the appeal to big society looks nothing other than a heightened endorsement of the Euro-American proclivity to make society. But there's a bit more to be said than that. For a while, it's been a subject of discussion in anthropology that some form of contrast between what is assumed and what is acted upon, between the given and the constructed, is like the perception of difference, to be understood as a ubiquitous and general feature of concept formation. What is assumed is innate to the context out of which or against which any idea or intention appears to be drawn. In simple terms, one could say that what is assumed is one side of what is also made evident, and vice versa, and this applies to any act of articulation. A concept thus involves a simultaneous activation of figure and ground. It's a particular tradition of thought, what I've been calling Euro-American, that articulates this relationship through knowledge practices that includes anthropological theorizing itself. The same tradition also displays the relationship through a categorical contrast between nature and society. As with society itself, the nature-society antonym has long ceased to be of much analytical use in anthropology. But that has not stopped the ethnographic conceptualization of figures and grounds, or of an interest in relations between the constructed and the given. We've seen that what Euro-Americans understand as nature does not everywhere stand for the innate, for a background that, not in itself being agency or agentive, motivates action or intention. Yanomami assume that it is the constitutive conventions of a conscious life, similar to what Euro-Americans would call society, albeit one shared with other creatures, that are unalterably given. What is malleable to explicit effort lies in the manifest bodies of people and animals that Euro-Americans would regard as naturally formed. In contemporary Amazonia and the Andes alike, making kinship or making race appear as explicit endeavors that engage properties of kinship and race that Euro-Americans take as biological givens. By contrast, making society is a shorthand for the way in which Euro-Americans imagine that it is their conventional or relational world that is constructed. The idea that the social is made endures in innumerable efforts to nurture, change, classify the relations of diverse entities between one another. The coordination with which the Australian healthcare officials were struggling, the vision that gets fragmented in workshops and spreadsheets and the superabundance of activity, spoke to the need to make an organisation that would organise. But haven't I walked myself into a contradiction here? For those who imagine society as requiring constant activation, the UK government, with its apparatus of organisation and coordination, makes society whether it likes it or not. Yet earlier, I was talking about how society could be taken for granted, and faced with big society, even hinting it might be best left alone. But this is precisely the difference between what must be worked on and what is assumed. And in the second case, what in fact is being assumed about society is nothing other than a version of nature, people's axiomatic and innate drive to enact forms of sociability, shown in the tendency to form local communities, in the loyalties they evince to groups, in the impulse to help others, and so forth. All this is regarded as inherent to, and thus as natural features of social life, or, in the vernacular, of human nature. To assume the existence of society, in its form not of organisation, but of innate sociability, is to put it beyond explicit control. This is where its cosmological dimensions come from. In these English-speaking Euro-American formulations, it can appear as always larger than what it's made of. But if making society doesn't always have benign consequences, too much activity, for example, neither does assuming society. And I'm going back again to the rhetoric. The irony of a centralised directive for decentralisation is lost on no one. Calling on society, as in big society, respects its rhetorical status, but is simultaneously a challenge to it. The very invocation compromises its innate and assumed character. I've suggested that it's this innate character that compels much of its motivational force. Lodged in the imaginations of people and politicians alike, glimpsed in manifold situations, society may be enacted anywhere. At the moment of application by an organisation, invocation by policymakers, however, the context of the action becomes something else. Assumed society is recontextualised as part of a making society project. In the instant of assuming that people know what is meant by this empty term, it is appropriated for organisational purposes. And here lies danger, or at least short-sightedness. For the popular understandings easiest to prey upon, a concept of society as interpersonal context, communities, localism, is so very partial. And this partiality is reinforced through being played back by policies that seemingly wish to remain in ignorance of the possibility that anything else could be meant. So let me unfold that a bit. For a start, how is society's taken for granted or assumed character itself reproduced? Where are the people going to come from who will know what is meant when it's appealed to? What kind of experiences do they need to have had? Will families and local solidarities and friendships do the trick when most time is spent in spheres beyond them? People's experiences are central to what they take for granted, but should surely not themselves be taken for granted by anyone interested in the quality of existence. And in many understandings of social scientists these days, society doesn't follow the contour of community at all. Rather, it can be seen in the distributed or networked agency of any collectivizing project. in assemblages of instruments, artifacts, events, and some would argue it doesn't have to be a society of human agents alone. At the same time, getting rid of a conventional view of the social doesn't relieve anyone of what the social scientist might analyze as the activity of making society. In other words, the Euro-American imperative to find organizational roots to reform collective life, however vast, anonymous, or heterogeneous the circumstances, is alive and well. As a geographer, Asher Min refers to this as an imperative, the need to be making, in relation to urban living. The civility of indifference, as he calls it, or skills of cohabitation that could underlie a politics of living together, he writes, may require a deliberate attempt to foster this orientation. And I'm quoting, "The task for a politics of togetherness is to make the connections and dependencies visible. Through continual acts of renewal of a living urban commons, the city can be built. In situated knowing, success is the product of putting things together, inventing a commons, harnessing all manner of human and non-human capability, cultivating care for the task in hand, and working at the problem over and again." And this lays bare the cost of ignorance, the cost of a government making assumptions about society. The big society, I've been saying, is so much less than anybody, let alone the social scientist, means by society. Among other things, in exactly the same manner as Thatcher's "there's no such thing," Cameron's big society removes the institutions of government from it. And the pity of this particular move is that government thereby removes its oversight, and one might have thought that taking care was importantly part of the government's job of making society too. Taking care includes becoming knowledgeable about the conditions under which people live. For if the government were to look a bit more closely, it would surely find social forms closer to the land of strangers that Amin describes than to local communities. The city he referred to as being built houses a veritable society of strangers. He makes a vigorous case for an anti-communitarian approach, for acknowledging that social life does not depend on face-to-face contact and recognition among familiars. A politics of care, he writes, if this is the appropriate approach to integration in the society of strangers, can be decentered from considerations of interpersonal obligation and civic orientation. Yet by invoking society as a taken-for-granted construct, the government is also evoking exactly these very partial understandings. Amin does not apply his critique directly to big society rhetoric, but I do. Big society imagines communities as street parties rather than say, as the kinds of epistemic collaborations or communities of practice as arise in the workplace, vested in protocols and techniques of communication, not necessarily based at all on interpersonal recognition. A concrete example also hints at why it might be helpful to find out, although I'm not going to dwell on this. Another anthropologist, this time writing on the global stock market, focuses her attention on the securing of collaterals. She argues that diverse humdrum legal techniques carried out by bureaucrats are crucial to the market in complex ways rarely appreciated outside. Collaterals back up certain kinds of financial deals, putting on the table the wealth that guarantees creditworthiness. Thus, collateral property is quoted as underlying the security of transactions, even though such property frequently turns out to have its own risky entanglements. Trust in the techniques, in the procedures and practices by which collaterals are secured bypasses the kind of face-to-face interactions on which ideas of trust might otherwise have rested. Instead of trusting social relations, she says, you trust collateral. This is the real life, social life of documents, legal devices, and technical instruments without which the market could not operate. In light of the present topic, the study gives insight into what happens when such technical procedures are politicized. From the industry's point of view, and that is the financial industry's point of view, collateralization is, I quote, explicitly viewed as the private market-based alternative to greater governmental regulation. In fact, in this private technology of regulation, collateral acts rather like the society evoked by big society. On the one hand, the everyday legal techniques through which collateral is deployed remain largely taken for granted by financial traders. On the other hand, the legal description of assets in the promise of their realization creates financial value, a routine equivalent of the Cuban inventive definition or infinition, perhaps. A point in the future has already arrived. A promise for then has value now, such that the procedural forms used to define collateral relations have ontological effect. And I quote, "They are practical interventions with concrete consequences." And isn't big society rhetoric somehow assuming that the concept of society can be treated on the side, to be drawn on as a kind of collateral to the work of government? It can be used in the here and now to shore up the government's credibility as a lean and pared down operator on the simple basis of society's future and ever undefined promise. Well, I could end here, or I could burst into PowerPoint. But I hope you'll allow me a few more minutes to wrap up my comments. The allusion to PowerPoint being a reluctant admission that a diagram or two might have helped. If you'll bear with me on these double grounds, I want to explain my title, Taking Care of Concepts and the Assisted Society. The concept of society is obviously treated in myriad ways, including conveying its marvelous capacity for the vacuous. However, depending on where you stand, taking it as empty turns out to be happier in some contexts, turns out to be more happy in some contexts than in others. From where I stand, it has both positive and negative values. So what, in relation to its recent political appropriation in the UK, are the contexts that make a difference? Now I want you to imagine a simple 2x2 matrix. Okay, I'll become the PowerPoint. Across one side, first, as I've tried to bring to life, the specific life of practices and techniques, inviting us to scrutinize the circumstances under which people live, where the social scientist might or might not find society analytically appropriate. And second, the rhetorical, cosmological concept of society as all things to all people, 1, 2. And down one side, first, the organizational effort, which I've tried to bring to life also, that goes into making society, and second, assuming its society's existence, at least in the sense that innate sociability is assumed. Okay, thank you. The way in which the contexts are combined have radically different effects. To imagine sliding between the four resulting positions, which are four positions from my own understanding, gives us a bit of purchase on what people in the UK find, in no particular order, frustrating or uplifting or disgraceful or forceful about the big society. And this is where your final forbearance is requested as I dilate on each. Position 1. Making society in relation to specifiable practices wherever they are, in health programs or financial markets, and whatever one's political views on regulation, entails addressing problems defined in the same register in which they're tackled. And this seems to me like the ordinary work of government. Collectivizing projects that require the specification of relations, classification, monitoring, covariation to bring social life into being are in the same register as bureaucratic means of administration. And insofar as big society is just another policy outlook, it will command resources and effort from government departments. But while it must be seen to deliver, and communities must prove their togetherness just as in Northern Australia, better health must be auditable on a graph, the big society is also imagined as bypassing these very bureaucratic means, government by magic, if you like. Position 2. Assuming society in the same context, on the other hand, is to ignore, overlook, neglect the techniques, structures and institutions that are also part of people's lives. This is the blind spot of big society. Rolling back the state, society carrying the burden the government wants to shrink for itself, implies overlooking social arenas, including those of finance and urban space, as social arenas. Instead, the big society assumes a reserve of sociability that can be appropriated without investing in its continuity. Think of the paradox. Treating society as self-sustaining means not attending to the reproduction of people's lives, not worrying about the effects of unemployment, welfare cuts, home allowances, or mental health. Think of the effect of chronically short-term, high-turnover health workers on the quality of care in Amazonia. Position 3. When we turn to the context of the rhetorical and otherwise empty concept of society, we find that it works most powerfully through people assuming society, letting it flourish as a taken-for-granted basket of values. That it means all things to all people is its power. So society is a piece of rhetoric with its cosmological resonance, works best when it's taken for granted and not predefined. Here the invocation of big society looks as though it has a head start. But then big society invocation turns into big society implementation. What people enact is one thing, to be told to perform is another. There is something of a parallel in the Andes with reference to the nation-making project. It is taken for granted by white Criollo clinicians that clients for egg donation wanting to be white will always want white eggs. In fact, they don't. Position 4. Yet trying to make society on the back of that cosmological apprehension reduces it to some very conventional understandings. This is the position from which I understand the big society as society assisted. The phrase implies the necessity, the phrase big society, that is, implies the necessity to assist society by nudging people to become locally engaged, both to show what communities are and what, with help, they could become. It's not just that the big society rhetoric identifies a fund of innate sociability beyond government that can be drawn on by government as a kind of ever-present resource, like the financier's collateral, but that the resource is underdeveloped. Unlike the positive equation between assistance and dependency found in the Andes, dependency is devalued. A future society may be traded, so to speak, as an evident resource, but it may equally well appear as an inchoate nature that needs assistance to make it effective and that has somehow failed to get its act together, or there would, in this view, be no need of government at all. Now, one could imagine dozens of matrices, but on the 4 positions that have helped my understanding, the big society gets into a twist each time. So what should the anthropologist be taking care of? In the Andean and Amazonian instances, for the subjects of care, taking care was a matter of ensuring relational well-being. Not so different in some ways from what Amin hopes when, in lieu of the face-to-face care of the stranger, which conserves the strangeness of the stranger, he advocates an everyday and ubiquitous attentiveness. It is thoroughly appropriate to Euro-American knowledge practices that academics, scholars, and critics should wish to be attentive to the relational life of the concepts they deploy. In an open society, and I use the term rhetorically, part of that attentiveness might be to prefer that people take care of the concept of society in different ways, without themselves presuming the social form that it will manifest, leaving it empty for anyone including, of course, themselves, to use. And a brief final paragraph. Collaterals are assemblages of glitches. Thus the ethnographer, and her comment is worth quoting in full. So in place of networks, peoples, institutions, experts, and ideas that create coherent standards, new forms of transparency, communities of expertise, a coherent doctrinal or sociological whole, I suggest, she says, that we understand the ensemble of legal techniques that make up the private governance of markets as an assemblage of glitches, pockets of lack of knowledge, breaks between theory and practice, genres of opacity, differences in ontological status, lack of understanding of the agency and expertise of others. We have a flurry of activity that is not building anything in particular, that does not add up to a new source of epistemological or judicial authority. And a return for the last time to the Australian health workers. Faced with evidence for the continuing deterioration of those under their care, they ratchet up a version of making society. Constant effort meant constant personal and emotional input, the ever-present compulsion to do something. They invested heavily in organizational means, programs, workshops, flowcharts. What they appeared to assume was that such society, that's my term, as those under their care might evince, and we're talking about people living in Aboriginal settlements, that is the Aboriginal objects of their care, was not going to be that their, whatever society the Aboriginals might have, was not going to be adequate for the problem that the health workers had defined. I'm not myself sure that assuming the reverse, that people can be taken out of the care of government, since society is already more than adequate with nudging to rise to the occasion, is a happier alternative, and it's certainly not an informed one. Thank you.